in Canada. I've been to Ottawa numerous times. I love that city. I have yet to be there in the dead of winter, so I've yet to see the winter-like trenches to look like the opening scene from Empire Strikes Back, as what I hear it's like there. But I long to see it. I would love one of these days to skate down the river, down the canal. But time will tell when that can happen again. So I do appreciate you spending your time this afternoon with me and giving me a little bit of your attention so I can speak on this topic of Christ and the cancel culture. And the reason I want to talk about this with you today is because we're in the throes of this right now. We're in the throes of this cancel culture that no longer entertains reasoned and spirited debate without equating it with some form of hate mongering or vilification. And I don't care what side of the aisle you're actually on, if you're right of center or left of center, somehow we've come to see each other as out for the worst possible outcome, and that our motives are the worst possible motives. And so what we don't allow each other to do is actually speak in a way that allows us to defend our position or offer a counter to someone else's position. It just doesn't allow for reasoned debate anymore, and so we just cancel people. The reason why I want to bring this up in the context of the Christian faith is that this seems like it's a new phenomenon. You know, we think that the cancel culture is a new phenomenon. It's a result of the social media age, where you can follow a bunch of people, and if you're famous and you have a lot of followers, or whether you're an author or a speaker or a movie star or an athlete of some kind, you have a lot of followers, whether it's on Instagram or Twitter or whatever it might be, and you're starting to gain an influence. And then you happen to say something that goes against what the culture expects and accepts as particularly fitting to what the culture says is okay. If you happen to say something that runs afoul of that, if you say something that runs afoul of the current acceptable strictures on sexuality, on identity, on politics, you name it. If you happen to go against that and you say something either intentionally or even unintentionally, they won't ask you your position. They won't ask for clarification. What your followers will end up doing is canceling you. They will drop you from following you, and so the followers plummet, but also they'll stop buying your books. They'll stop going to your movies. They'll stop buying the shoes that you sponsor, whatever it might be. These things are ways to cancel somebody. And then what follows that is the deluge of personal attacks, where you're made to feel like somehow you're the most evil person in the world for having an opinion that happens to go against what the culture and the community thinks is socially acceptable. And so there is a groupthink that's forming that prevents people from actually engaging in spirited debate outside of the acceptance of the group. Now, again, this seems like a new phenomenon, given the way the news works. And I've said it before, and I'll say it again, that 24-hour news is one of the worst inventions of the past 40 years, because we now have to fill up 24 hours when it can take us about an hour to tell all the news that's going on in the world. You can do it in about an hour. And so what you do is you fill up 23 hours of the day with seeming news that's really given through the guise of fact reporting, which is just opinion mongering. And that, of course, creates the rancor. And of course, social media is the ultimate way in which people can express an opinion without actually being face-to-face. There's an anonymity that allows a cruelty and a meanness that happens. So it seems like the cancel culture is a new phenomenon. May I suggest something to you? May I suggest that it's actually not new. It's actually quite old. It's thousands of years old. This is a phenomenon that might be new to the Western experience, but it is quite old hat to the Middle Eastern and the Eastern experience. And that's why I want to bring this to you, because Jesus and the message of the gospel has now come to be seen as either dangerous when it comes to various social things that we're facing today, or outdated. It's more likely it's considered outdated, well-meaning, it was okay for that time, but now it's outdated. We no longer need the Bible because we have an enlightened perspective on so many things. And Jesus, this sort of revolutionary teacher that was good for his day, is no longer good for us today. I want to challenge that, because the cancel culture we're seeing today, where people are shamed out of their opinions, is actually the exact same culture that Jesus worked, lived, died, and rose from the dead in. which makes it interesting that Jesus, though he's considered to be outdated, outmoded, and irrelevant to today, is actually more relevant than ever for the Westerner, even though he's a Middle Easterner. So what I want to defend in the time we have is the way in which Jesus is transcultural and transtemporal. He crosses cultures east and west, but he also crosses cultures across the centuries from the beginning of the modern era, or sorry, the common era, well into our modern era today in ways that speak, I think, volumes to what's happening in our culture today. Now, how I defend that is basically to tell you this, is that when missiologists, people who study missions work, or even sociologists study different cultures, they often divide them up into ways in which they understand and enforce morality. Because morality is the chief sort of undercurrent for how that culture thinks. So here in the West, we have a strong sense of individualism. You know, we have this sort of pioneering spirit. Both the United States and Canada were essentially founded by pioneering spirits, and that had some wonderful aspects to it, some not so great aspects to it too, if you happen to already be here when Europeans arrived. But there is a certain level to which we understand this individualism that is at the heart of Western innovation and Western progress, and the legal frameworks that we base Westernism on, which is in the US, the Bill of Rights and the charters that allow us freedoms of speech, freedom of religious expression, freedom of thought, freedom to address our government and protest and address our government for regresses. And what we try to do is enforce individual rights through our various documents. And that's a wonderful thing, because it allows the flowering of individuality. It allows the innovation of thought, whether it's social thought, whether it's scientific thought, whether it's political thought, or even religious thought. And that's wonderful. But like every good thing, individualism has its bad side, or its shadow side, I should say. And the shadow side of individualism is, with all of its wonders and all of its positives, what we tend to do is not think of the collective. We tend to think in terms of the enforcement of our individual rights and our individual freedoms, but we use those freedoms sometimes without care for how that actually affects people around us. So how it actually affects our families or our communities or the broader culture in general. And so we end up having a silo effect in the West. What that translates to for morality is this, is that morality is often individualistic and internal. So picture this: if I were to do something wrong, if I were to wrong someone, if I was to go against the cultural mores of the time, or if I were to breach some sacred trust I have with a friend, like maybe I talked bad about them behind their back, or I betrayed some confidence they had, or something like that, I do that, and there's an inner sense, an individualized sense of conscience that gnaws at me and pushes me towards confessing it and then making up for it, doing something good to make up for the something bad I've done. In other words, now I feel an inner sense of guilt, and I long to be innocent. And how I become innocent from my guilt is to do something to make up for what I've done. Now, in the East, we have something very different, but the Eastern sense is just as moral, but it's got a different locus of enforcement. So in the East, individualism is important, but it's not as important as the collective. So in the East, we have a strong sense of not only family, and the family isn't just a nuclear family, it's the extended family with cousins and aunts and uncles, and it broadens out. And we often think of our own rights and our freedoms, but we always curtail them by how they affect not only our family, but the community, and then from the community, the broader culture, and the broader culture into the nation. So if I have a freedom of religious belief, for example, if I have a freedom of conscience to be able to express my religious beliefs or my political beliefs as I like, it will almost always be not legally, but culturally curtailed by an impetus to say, you must conform to what the culture actually accepts. Because if you don't, that will bring shame to your family and to your culture. And of course, bringing shame to them would be the ultimate dishonor and the ultimate immoral behavior. So you can see how good that can be in one sense, is that we think not only in terms of our individual freedoms, but we always consider in the East and in the Middle East, ways in which our individual freedoms impact the collective in a positive and a negative sense. So that's wonderful because we're thinking of others. The shadow side to that is that oftentimes the culture can dictate what you do and say and believe, even if the culture is wrong. So for example, in my own journey of faith, I came from a Muslim background, and because I'm Middle Eastern in my heritage, there is this intense sense of what I do and what I believe reflects on my family. Now, along the way, I began to see the veracity and the truth and the verifiability of the Christian faith. But why it took 9 years for me to become a Christian was because of the impact it would have on everybody around me. And I couldn't face up to the impact it would have, and it would be very difficult for me to do that. Eventually, I was able to do that. And I know many people from Hindu backgrounds, from Eastern religious backgrounds, who have a very hard time when they're faced with the truth of something, like the truth of the gospel. They can acknowledge it, but they can't accept it, because what ends up happening is it factors into that sense of, I'm dishonoring people I love and bringing shame upon myself because of the collective. So individual searches for truth are given lip service, but oftentimes they're overshadowed by a sense of the collective. So it has a good side, but it also has a bad side. So the West is basically an innocence and guilt culture, and the East is basically an honor and shame culture. In the East, you strive to do that which brings honor, whether it's real or perceived, and you strive to avoid that which brings shame, whether it's real or perceived. But look out. When you look at the way the West is working with the cancel culture is just the honor and shame paradigm with Western dress, with a Western expression through social media and all these things. You can see the parallels, can't you? That the way in which you enforce morality now is not by the individual sense of conscience, it's by the collective saying, we're going to shame you into conforming your views to our views, or there'll be consequences to pay, including shaming. Let me give you an example. Very recently, the wildly popular author, J.K. Rowling, who authored the Harry Potter series of books, among other books, millions and millions of copies sold, just wildly popular. J.K. Rowling is an advocate for women who have experienced abuses of various kinds. Now, in her role in doing that, she actually talks about how she believes that there are such things as biological males and biological females, and that gender is not a social construct. Well, even though she tends to lean left politically and socially, she has this view that men are biologically actually men and women are biologically actually women, and there's no real sense of fluidity between the two. I'm simplifying her views quite a bit here, but I have to do it for the sake of time. Now, she makes that statement, and what ends up happening to her is that she is excoriated by those who followed her. She was losing followers on social media. People were saying to boycott her books. Even some of the people who were in the films that were based on her books were distancing themselves from her because she was going against what the culture had accepted was the only acceptable position when it came to gender. And she held on to her guns. She stuck to her guns, and she stuck to that because she's quite brave. And she stuck to that. Now, in the midst of all that, she, along with many other public intellectuals and writers and thinkers, signed on to an open letter that was published in Harper's. And in Harper's, it was basically a letter that said we have to do away with the cancel culture because the cancel culture will eventually stifle all semblance of free speech. So she said we have to do, so her and I think 100 and something other people had said we have to do away with this cancel culture. We don't always agree on everything, but it is unpopular speech that needs to be protected, not popular speech, because populism protects popular speech, but it is our sense of freedom of speech that protects unpopular speech. Well, it was received rather well by some, by many, but then here's the interesting thing. A particular person, a particular signatory to the document was asked in an interview, I think it was, did you agree with the statement? She said, yes. Did you believe everything in the statement? For the most part, yes. I believe the fundamental core tenets of the statement that was published in Harper's, that we should do away with the cancel culture and not try to shun unpopular speech. Did you know that J.K. Rowling happened to sign it? And she said, really? I want my name removed. Isn't that interesting? That's fascinating that in a document that says don't cancel people, When she found out that the wrong kind of person happened to sign the same document, remove me from the thing, I want to cancel that person. That's the kind of thing that I'm talking about now. And this is exactly the kind of thing that Jesus dealt with in his own ministry, in his own experience. I'm going to race through an example relatively quickly, but to show you that this is happening in the West is important for us to understand. And it's happening on a day-to-day level too. You know, in a country as diverse as Canada, especially the major cities where there's many, many Easterners who make their home in Toronto, Ottawa, the greater Toronto area, in Vancouver, and even in the prairies. I remember being in Calgary at a very large open forum, and I saw exactly what I'm talking about in terms of the Eastern paradigm manifesting itself in the West. So when you look at the Bible and you look at Jesus's interactions with people, you see that he's questioned quite a bit. And there are two ways he's questioned, and those working in politics know that pretty much this is how it works all the time as well. So Jesus is he's either asked questions publicly or he's asked them privately. Now, you'll notice something. When you read the Bible, Jesus, when he's asked something publicly, it's never really to get information. It's usually to show him up, to show him to be the kind of person who should not be listened to, that the people who are gathering around Jesus are being taught by a charlatan. So they're doing what scholars have called the honor game, where you ask a question, not with the hope of getting an answer, but you ask a question worded such that no matter what the person says, you've got them, and they'll look like a fool no matter what they answer in front of the crowd. So if you do that, you will gain honor in the crowd's sight, and they will lose honor in the crowd's sight. So that's how the public challenges were done in the Middle East. They're still done that way now, but back in Jesus's day. Example, when the Sadducees come and ask Jesus a question, and the Sadducees, as you may know, were a group of people who did not believe in a physical resurrection. They did not believe in an afterlife. They believed that once you die, you stay dead. That's all there is to it. You're done. And Jesus, of course, believed in a resurrection and an afterlife. And so to challenge that belief, they try to make him look stupid. So they come to Jesus and they butter him up a little bit, saying he doesn't give deference to anybody and he's a wonderful teacher and all these things. And they ask him a question. They say, Jesus, there was a guy among us who was married, and before he had children, he died. And so according to our custom, his wife is to marry his brother as long as that brother is not already married. So she married the man's brother. And before they could have children, that brother died. And this happened over and over again, 7 times, I think it was, in the Bible. So she's been married 7 times to different brothers, no children, and then she dies. So our question for you, Jesus, is this. In the resurrection, whose wife will she be? We're trying to make it look like a ridiculous thing that someone could be raised from the dead, given all the social problems that would come about and religious problems. Now, Jesus answers them because he knows their intention is not to get an answer to their question. It's to try to trap him. It's to play the honor game. And he says to them, you don't know the scriptures. In other words, he's basically saying, you're ignoramuses. Now, Jesus being Jesus, he says you're an ignoramus in the nicest possible way. So he points out that they don't know the scriptures. What he's saying is that you read the words, but you lose the art of understanding the heart of what's behind those. In those days, in the resurrection, they will neither be married nor given in marriage. And he goes on to talk about the resurrection of the dead, not in a way that just puts down his questioners. You see, they were playing the honor game. They were seeking to cause Jesus to lose honor so they could gain some. Jesus is not interested in this. But what he does is he turns it around on them and uses it as a way to dignify the crowd. You see, the crowd is looking for hope. The crowd is looking for a hope beyond legalism, that they are looking for something real and substantive as well. And Jesus offers them a defense of the resurrection in the light of a hostile question. So he takes the air out of the hostility of the question while giving hope to the crowd. So he's not interested in gaining his own honor, but he is interested in having the crowd get hope. In the process, the Sadducees lose honor because they played the game and they lost. Now, that's an important thing for us to understand, is that oftentimes when we're confronted with these kind of things, the first thing we want to do is play the game back and play gotcha back better than our opponents do. But Jesus, as well as he does it, he also offers those who are listening a real hope and a real ability to understand the truth. Contrast this, that the Sadducees say, with Nicodemus, who comes to Jesus under cover of night, privately, because he's afraid that the Jewish leaders will kick him out of the synagogue, the ultimate cancellation. And so he comes to Jesus under cover of night so he can ask him a question and get a real answer. This happened in Calgary to me. I saw this happen. I was at a large open forum, and the audience was mixed in terms of belief systems and various different ethnicities. You had a lot of white folks, you had a lot of color there. You had Indians, you had people from African descent, you had people from Southern Asian descent. You had all kind of folks who were there. It was wonderful. It looked like a wonderful, beautiful spice rack of people. It was fantastic. And what you ended up seeing in the Q&A period was fascinating, because during the Q&A, you could ask questions two ways. You could ask questions on a text message if you were afraid in front of a large crowd to ask a question, or you'd come to the microphone. And the talk I was giving was on meaning. Can man have meaning without God? And so after the talk wrapped up, some people came to the microphone, some asked me actual questions to get an answer, but what I was noticing was the Easterners who did not agree with my worldview, who came to the microphone, did it in a very sort of pressing Sadducee-like way, where they said things, they were challenging me, and they were trying to make me look like I couldn't answer their question by asking a tough question. But one question from an Easterner stood out to me. It was over text. It wasn't at the microphone. And this young person, and I don't know if it's a young person or not, but I don't know if it's a woman or a man either, because it was anonymous over the text, and the moderator read it to me. And the question was, I'm a Muslim, and I believe in God, and you talked about God and meaning, but I believe in God, but I find my life to be meaningless. Why is that? What a contrast of a question. It was sincere, it was honest, but it was asked privately, because the honor-shame culture would dictate that the Muslim friends who were with that person would say, are you expressing a real doubt? How dare you? My goodness, you're going to shame the community. So you can see the way Jesus was asked questions 2,000 years ago is still pertinent today. Jesus, to quote Leslie Newbigin, is our eternal contemporary. He always applies at all times, and his method of application is important for each one of us. Let me just show you what I mean in a particular story in the Bible, and then I'll move on and finish so we can take some questions before our time runs out. You look at John chapter 9, and you see this encounter. It's a very familiar encounter to many of us. It's an encounter with Jesus and the young man who was born blind. So Jesus and the disciples are walking, and they see a young man who's born blind, and the disciples ask him a question about who sinned, this man or his parents, that he should be born blind. Jesus says, none. Neither one of them, neither he nor they sinned that this should happen, but this should happen that God could be glorified. So Jesus encounters the young man, and he goes to heal the man, and he doesn't have to touch him. He's healed many people without touching them. But for some reason, Jesus spits on the ground, makes mud with his spit, and applies them to the young man's eyes, and the young man is healed. So the first question you have to ask yourself is, why would Jesus make spit in order to do it? The answer is that Jesus is a troublemaker. That's why. Because he does this on the Sabbath day. So he makes mud because it is work on the Sabbath, knowing it will rouse the ire of the Pharisees. So he knows this already. So the young man is healed. He does what Jesus says, and he's telling everybody and their brother, everyone who will listen, that Jesus healed his blindness. Now, the Pharisees don't like this, because they've already told everybody, if you confess Jesus to be the Christ, you will be put out of the synagogue, the ultimate public cancellation, the ultimate shaming. You'll be put out of the synagogue. So people are afraid to say that Jesus is the one who's healing them, but not this young man. He's telling everybody who will listen. So the Pharisees question him, and he says it's Jesus. Then the Pharisees go to the young man's parents, and they say, is this really your son who you say was born blind? In other words, what they're saying is, we think a scam is afoot. This either isn't really your son, this new sighted guy, or he has never been blind. You're just using this as a scam so you can get money when he begs for his living. And what the parents say is remarkable, because they're so terrified of the cancellation. They say, we know this is our son, and we know he was born blind. In other words, don't accuse us of some kind of a fraud. But how he now sees, we do not know. That's a lie. It's a lie. Because the young man was telling everybody how he now sees and who healed them. And they're saying, we don't know. He didn't tell his parents, people who've been praying for him since birth, to have his sight restored so he wouldn't have to go through the shameful process of begging for his living. And they don't know how he sees. That cannot be true. In fact, the Bible tells us they said this because they feared that the Pharisees would kick them out of the synagogue. They feared the cancellation. Then they said something fascinating. They say, go ask him, he is of age. In other words, go ask our son. Now, it's fascinating they said he is of age. I'm going to speculate for a moment, if you allow me. Why did he say he is of age? The reason I think is because he just came of age. He doesn't look like it. So they could have said, go ask him. If he's obviously a grown man, go ask him. But they said, go ask him. He is of age. My guess is speculation that he doesn't look like it. In other words, he's a teenager. And they throw their teenage son under the bus. Well, they ask him. And with typical teenage hubris, he says, why are you asking me again? Do you want to be his disciples too? Very cocky, as it were. And the Pharisees make short work of him, and they cancel him. They kick him out of the synagogue. Well, Jesus's honor and shame radar pings, goes off. And he goes and he finds this young man, and he says to him, do you believe that I'm the Christ? And there's this interaction where Jesus reveals himself to this young man as the Christ, the very person that the Pharisees are trying to get him to deny. And he says to the young man, I have come that those who were blind may now see, but those who thought they could see are now shown to be blind. What he's doing is he's saying this to the young man. The cheap cultural honor that is bestowed upon you by hypocrites can be replaced by the eternal honor that can be bestowed only by the Son of God. In other words, in a cancel culture, you're going to lose some things if you hold on to your integrity. But if you follow Christ, he will replace what is easily lost, which is that which can never be taken. The Bible speaks transculturally, and it's something important for us to see. It speaks to it not only in Jesus' words, but even centuries before in the Psalms. In Psalm 25, verses 2-3, oh my God, in you I trust. Let me not be put to shame. That's Eastern. Let not my enemies exult over me. Indeed, none who wait for you shall be put to shame. But just a few verses later, something Western pops in. The psalmist says, for your name's sake, O Lord, pardon my guilt, for it is great. God pardons our guilt, which brings honor to us through his name. And so that's a wonderful thing for us to see, is that Jesus is our eternal contemporary. He's not just some dusty old guy in a dusty old place written in a dusty old book that we don't need to see anymore. Jesus speaks the honor and shame culture that is quickly becoming as Western as it possibly can be. We just call it the cancel culture. So I want to leave you with this. It's just a simple quote from Isaac Watts, the great hymn writer, who talks about the way in which the cross, where Jesus bears our guilt so we can be deemed innocent, though he is innocent himself, or he despises the shame for the joy set before him, which is that we would receive his honor. Honor and shame, innocence and guilt merging at the cross. Isaac Watts puts it so beautifully when he says, the Lord is just and kind, the meek shall learn his ways, and every humble sinner find the methods of his grace. For his own goodness' sake, he saves my soul from shame. He pardons though my guilt be great, in my Redeemer's name. Many of us are facing a very tough road when it comes to the cancel culture, is that speech, ideas, thoughts are being vilified. But let us never forget that Jesus didn't die for those who loved him. He died for those who vilified him. And he can save all of us from our guilt and from our shame and give us the innocence that comes from having his honor. I'll be happy to take your questions now. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Abdu. That was really, that hit home. That was really good. I really appreciated that. For all those on the call, Abdu actually has a book set called Seeing Jesus from the East, which he goes into greater depths to the part of what he was talking about. So if this is something you want to explore even more, feel free to check that out. It's highly recommended by Daniel Gimlin. And if you look at his photo background, he reads a lot of books. So that probably means something of significance as well. So yeah, we're going to enter into the Q&A section. Feel free to send me any questions that you have. And I will be happy to ask Abdu and get a response from him. First question, given that we already have some in the queue, we talk a lot about cancel culture. Is it possible that we could overcorrect in trying to correct cancel culture? Can we go too far on the opposite direction? Essentially, are there some ideas or some forms of speech that should and ought to be censored?
Wow, what a great question that is. I would answer the question from from two basic premises. The first premise is this, is that from a Christian perspective, all people are made in God's image. All people, even those we very seriously and morally disagree with, are made in his image. So that's the first thing. And I say that because the second premise is this, is that all people are equally deserving of compassion and respect, unless they lose that, respect in terms of a cultural respect. But all people are equally ontologically equal, but the ideas they have are not. The ideas they have are not. Obviously, there are some ideas that we ought to respond to, but I think that the way to avoid overcorrection is not to cancel those ideas out, but to deluge them with more substantive and beautiful and morally praiseworthy speech. So I think this is where the cancel culture loses, is that let's say there's something someone says, let's say it's a racist comment, and let's say they said it and it was completely based on a sort of a subconscious racism or an unconscious sort of statement that they've made all their lives, not even really realizing the context of it, because they've been acclimated to a racist, to some racism. They happen to say something, they don't mean it in a racist way. Now that person gets canceled, and they realize now that nothing I can possibly say can fix that. And so there's no redemption there. The cancel culture doesn't allow for any form of redemption, that someone can say, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry for what I've said. I never would have said it had I known what it meant. Or they did mean it, and they come to realize the error of their ways. There's almost no coming back. There's no second chances in a cancel culture. Rather, when you overcome either ignorant or willfully immoral speech with something that is informed and willfully moral, I think you overcome that with ideas and the beauty of truth. And you don't try to drown out, but you do try to overcome. This is a biblical principle. Biblical principle is you don't return an insult for an insult, and you don't overcome evil with evil, but you return evil with good. And at that point, I think that's how the conversation turns to what's beautiful and lovely and true and honorable, as opposed to a cancel culture, which signals a sense of fear. See, I think truth is not afraid of falsehood. I don't think truth is afraid of falsehood. I think falsehood is afraid of truth. But a cancel culture makes it look like the truth is afraid of the falsehood and will stomp it out at any given moment. And I think that shows maybe the heart of those who are doing the canceling rather than the positions they hold. So yes, we can overcorrect. We certainly can by trying to stamp out illicit, not illicit, but I'm sorry, but speech we find so aberrant. A Nazi idea, for example, racism, sexism, these kind of things. These are ideas that ought to be countered. They have to be countered. But how we counter them is important. Because if we allow them, and when we give tolerance, the way tolerance is defined today, it's full swing, then we won't challenge anybody. And terrible ideas can fester. But the cancel culture takes ideas that are bad and puts them to the underground, so you don't know who really believes them, because everyone's afraid to say something until they have enough of a groundswell where they can cancel you. But a freedom of ideas where you're actually engaging in free speech and you shore up a good idea with as many good arguments and as many good facts and as much winsomeness as you can will eventually overshadow the false. I think that's the way to avoid overcorrection.
Awesome. Thank you for your answer. You talked about J.K. Rowling, and obviously she's not a professed believer. So how should the church respond to acts of people being canceled, especially when the person doesn't hold to our moral standing and understanding?
That's great. I'm going to borrow a line from Oz Guinness, and I think it's original to Oz. He would be able to clarify. He said, oftentimes the reason why some people groups, whether it's Christians, non-Christians of various varieties, are often under suspicion because there's like a lobbying effect, like we're just interested in our own special interests, is because we constantly say we want justice, but we really mean just us. And if you, as a Christian, if you want to be consistent in your belief that truth wins the day and that people should be free to express themselves, if you want to have the freedom to express your convictions, not just worship in your house in a locked door where no one can see you, but actually publicly profess to be a Christian and live your life in a Christianly way, you have to allow for the fact that there's going to be people who can live and breathe and have their social being, as it were, in a way that's different and even antithetical to your beliefs. You have to allow for that. So when we see someone like, whether it's J.K. Rowling or Richard Dawkins, for example, has been canceled several times for his statements, who is no stranger to the sort of ugly speech that comes against the Christian faith. When he is canceled or put out of the debate forums, Christians should stand up for him. We should stand up for him. Even though we don't agree with what he says, we should say, this is wrong. It is wrong to cancel somebody for those reasons. Because secular people have done it. I mean, I've seen secular people who are extremely antithetical to religion in terms of their speech, who when they hear people of religious persuasions who have been canceled or deplatformed, they stand up for the religious. And they're right to do that. I think as Christians, we can disagree with the message while allowing for the possibility that someone's message should be shared. But we should always be able to, again, have that fundamental perspective of we can love and pray for people, but not love their ideas. Because although all people are equal, not all ideas are.
No, that's good. There's been this tendency, sorry, next question. There's been this tendency in apologetics to use the language of dialogue as opposed to debate. Do you think that this is necessary and helpful, or does this reflect the fear of having robust, confrontation between ideas?
That's a good one, because I've done both. I've done both dialogues and debates. And when a dialogue is done well, it is debate-like. And when a debate is done well, it's done dialogue-like. So what I mean by that is that you can come, so I've done dialogues with people who are from the Muslim background, with atheists and various backgrounds, and we come together on a common theme. So human beings have inherent value, a Christian and an atheist perspective. Now, during the course of a good dialogue, you won't have, look how much we agree. You'll start off with a common ground, the platform upon which you can actually jump off to see whose pool has actual water in it. But you have to start off with a common platform. And the dialogue says, we're not going to have a counterpoint response to each other, because what ends up happening sometimes is the person who wins is often the better debater, even though the evidence isn't necessarily on their side. So a dialogue can be helpful because it comes in a non-adversarial, but also a intellectually testable way. You can test each other's beliefs, especially in the crossfire sections of a good dialogue. So it comes on a common ground and says, how do we affirm each other's desire to have this moral good verified, but we have to justify it from our particular positions. So human beings have inherent value. If an atheist were to say this, he's got to justify how human beings have value without God. So he's saying the same thing as a Christian is saying. He's just saying, I don't believe it for the same reasons you believe it. And the Christian would say, from his perspective or her perspective. A debate, however, would pick a topic and say, you say this happened or didn't happen, or another person says the opposite. And so that's also great, because that's the crucible in which a lot of falsehood gets challenged and narratives get challenged. So you need debate as well, but debate can be done respectfully. The problem I think that debate has had now is it's got a bad PR image, is that debate is seen now as gladiatorial fights, where our champion is there and we're not really listening to the other side because we're waiting for our champion to lay the smackdown on the opponent, no matter what side of it we're on. So debate has gotten a bad name because we're no longer engaging in argumentation, we're engaging in quarrel. And we can rescue debate, I think, from quarrelsomeness and put it back to an exchange of ideas in a robust way. Think the microcosm of what I'm talking about. If you've watched the presidential debates, that's exactly, the first one was exactly what everybody else is doing, yelling at each other and interrupting. The second one, the one that just happened, whether or not you think it was the best debate in the history of the world ever, isn't the point, is that you noticed a very fundamental difference between the two. The second one wasn't a dialogue, it was a debate, but it was far different than the first one. And I think that's paradigmatic of what we're seeing now, is why debate is considered almost like a useless a gesture, because it's just a gladiatorial battle, as opposed to getting people who are in the middle to say, I want to consider that point of view.
Oh, that's good. Thanks for sharing. Someone said, I like how you explain the way Jesus responds to public questions. Would you please explain in detail the premise that Jesus took when responding to private questions? Example, the rich man in Matthew 19, or Nicodemus. And then I guess it's not a question, it's just ask for advice. What tips would you give for us to act like Jesus when answering these questions from friends?
So I'll give you the response in detail. You can get a couple of really great examples of how Jesus answers public questions in John chapter 4. And of course, Matthew 19 and other places. But John chapter 4 is really interesting because it's private. The disciples go off in Samaria, a place where Jesus is not welcome as a Jew. And he encounters a woman. So already you have a cultural issue, woman and a man. You have a religious issue, Jew and Samaritan. You have a cultural issue, she's a half-breed, so to speak. And you have a geographical issue, is that the Samaritans thought that the real temple should be where they live, on Mount RZIM, and that was destroyed by the Jews in retaliation to the defacing of the temple in Jerusalem by the Samaritans. So you have all kinds of problems. And she comes to him, and she's got a morally checkered past. She's got ethnic issues. She's got a huge chip on her shoulder. And as she engages in a seemingly hostile way to begin with, when he asks for a drink of water, he asks her for something, which is interesting because he makes himself the recipient of something she can bestow a blessing onto him. And she says, how is it that you, a Jewish man, ask me, a Samaritan woman, for a drink? I mean, that one statement is the chip on her shoulder is house-sized. And then Jesus begins to interact with her, and he gets into her life. He talks about her moral issues. He talks about her political issues. He allows her to address those things, but at the same time begins to get to the question behind the question, the objection behind the objection. He wants to talk to her. He's not interested in answering her questions. He's interested in answering her, because her questions don't need answers, but she does. And as he begins to unmask the things in her life, she's fascinated by this man. And she becomes the first cross-cultural evangelist. She goes and brings her entire Samaritan village, who rejected her, to go to Jesus, who they rejected as a Jew, and they spend 3 days with him, and she is the catalyst for them becoming believers in Christ. He didn't dismiss her issues, but he went beneath them and said, what's the issue behind the issue? What's going on with you? What is it about you personally? He was answering a person, not a question. And that leads me to the second tip, is that when you're talking with your friends about something, I can't remember who said it, Bernard Shaw maybe, I can't remember who said it, but he said, the greatest illusion about communication is the belief that it's actually happened. In other words, people think they're communicating, but all they're doing is engaging what I call yeah, but syndrome, where you can't stop saying yeah, but, because whenever someone says something, all you're doing is waiting for them to finish so you can rebut, as opposed to doing the very hard task of asking someone 2 questions. My friend Greg Kokel puts it this way in his book, Tactics. He says, if you ask 2 questions, you can stay in control of any conversation, but in a good way, in a dignified way. What do you mean? How do you know? What do you mean? How do you know? When you ask the what do you mean question, you're giving someone the dignity of explaining their view in a way that makes sure that you're not answering something that they're not actually saying. And then if they make a statement or a claim and you ask, what's the basis for that statement? How did you come to that conclusion? You're giving them the dignity of saying, I believe you're the kind of person who's thought this through. And maybe they're not, by the way, but at least you're giving them, according to that dignity to them, that maybe they thought this through, and asking for justification. And you'll find out oftentimes people haven't really thought it through all that much. And then when you have that and you've taken the time to listen and you ask some artfully worded questions, you can actually, through questions, ask them and point out some hidden assumptions or some basic flaws in their thinking that might get them to see, maybe I haven't thought this through as much as I should have. And that removes the rancor and the anger from the conversation, because you're not forcing your view on them. You're asking them their view, and then you're trying to elucidate the truth by taking that view and trying to understand it as much as possible, and then waiting for the turn when they ask you a question. So I think the greatest tip I can give someone is to be patient, ask questions, listen to the answers, and be slow to speak and quick to listen. There's this book, called the Bible, and it says that, and that's a great tip. It's super hard to follow. My goodness, it's hard to follow, especially when we have our convictions to express. But without it, I think we're just going to engage in quarrel, and we're going to ruin relationships rather than cultivate them.
Thank you. Thank you. This may be the last question, depending on how much time you have it takes to answer. I do have another question if you can answer quickly. But how do you balance between this strong anti-cancel culture stance and also, in Paul's letters, a number of times he's mentioned that you do not eat with these people, you do not associate with these people, you kind of remove yourself from these, which would seem like perhaps more of an Eastern cancel shame perspective.
Yeah. Well, and Paul's being nuanced. What a great question. Paul is being nuanced here, actually, is that he's taking the culture from which he comes and he's saying, look, this is something you have to do, but the context is pretty important. And if I'm not mistaken, in the context of when he's saying those things, is basically what he's saying is there's these people who are trying to change the actual engagement of church. In other words, you're out there interacting with the Gentiles, you're out there interacting with the non-Christian world, and you have to interact with them and try to influence them. Paul did it all the time. Jesus did it nonstop. He was talking with tax collectors and sinners and all these things. So he was engaging with them to convince them and to show them the truth of the gospel message and of who Jesus actually is. And Paul did the same thing. He did it constantly. What he's talking about, though, is to believers about how you cannot sit and you do not eat with them and all this. This is in the context of what church was like back then. Church was not big building funded by your donations that you go to once a week. Church was communal and very small, and often sponsored by a person who owned a house big enough, usually not huge, for a bunch of people to congregate. And so there was only so much time. This was a fledgling church where the message was getting out, but it was important for those who were taking advantage of that opportunity to change doctrine and to try to convince people that they should be followed either for money or to change their own ways and to change the gospel message for what it was, or to impose legalism on them. So Paul was saying, don't have fellowship in the church setting with these people because they will corrupt that church, as opposed to you can interact with them in a way that is out there, outside of their influence, to be able to change the church. Much like we would never invite an atheist or a Muslim or a Hindu to give the Sunday message at a church. They could come to our church because they're big enough now where it wouldn't be a negative influence, but to have fellowship with them in that way where they have an opportunity to speak could suggest that we're compromising our doctrine for the sake of inclusiveness. We can have inclusiveness without compromising them. I think that's what Paul is saying. He's not trying to cancel them. He's just trying to keep them from unduly influencing the church the way church was done back then.
Awesome. Thank you. That's a very good answer. We only have a minute left, so I think we'll stop it there. Abdu, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us. I think your message is very relevant to the culture we're living in, and the gospel hope and gospel solution, I think, is something that we can offer the world. And we just pray that we follow God faithfully and can, and even in these awkward times, lead people to know him. And thank you very much.
My pleasure, everyone. Thank you so much for the honor of giving me your time today. I very much appreciate it.
Awesome. All right, everybody. Thank you. And have a good rest of your day.